All right, so I wanted to talk really quickly about upcoming roadmap for both the open source side and some things on the commercial side. So, I feel like kind of a mage in the video game. I'm playing a lot of Dragon Age Inquisition, which is good, but I feel that it betrays its D&D Baldur's Gate roots in ways I find profoundly disturbing. So, if any of you have played that and want to hear me complain about it, come find me. All right, so I think right off the bat on the open source side, I think the first thing I want to talk about is the sort of cadence of open source releases for a bunch of the different projects we have. And I think, historically our cadence has been, well, it is what it is, but I'll say that we're probably going to start moving a lot more quickly, I think, on the open source side. So I think concretely what that means is you'll probably see more major versions happen sooner. For example, the delta between open source Puppet 2.0 and 3.0 was like 2.5 years or 3 years or something like that. The delta between 3.0 and 4 was maybe a little south of 2 years, something like that. I think the delta between 4 and 5 is probably going to look like, my goal is for us to have Puppet 5 out before the end of the year. So just to let people know that that's going to be happening. Now what that means is not necessarily like, well, now with Puppet 5, all of your modules break and you have to completely port everything over again, because that would be terrible. But semantic versioning kind of dictates that if there are certain changes that we make, maybe there are certain things that are maybe backwards incompatible, but broadly speaking, your modules should not be overly affected, except maybe a handful of changes, then it has to be a new major version. So I think you'll start seeing more of that. And I think that's just to sort of cement kind of the difference between, the open source side of things tends to be the bleeding edge, right? Which tends to be a kind of standardized thing. Obviously, on the commercial side, there are pinned versions with long-haul support, security patches, that kind of stuff. But on the open source side, most of the development is going to be focused on, the last release in the previous major and head of current master branch, because that's where all the development actually occurs. That's kind of already happening. It's kind of been happening for a while, but I figured I would let everybody know that that stuff is basically going to be going on. On the agent side, one thing we'll see with the release of Puppet 4 is we've moved to basically all-in-one omnibus-style packages for agents on all the platforms that you can get on the open source side. So that has there are a couple of trade-offs there. I think the main reason why we wanted to do that is because for broad compatibility with a bunch of different distros, operating systems, etc., this will shock no one, not every distro has the same version of all the dependencies that we would need. Say, for example, what version of Ruby ships in RHEL 5? Probably something from the 1800s. They literally ship, I think, like 187 or something like that, which, by the way, has been end of life by the Ruby maintainers like months and months ago. So for us as an upstream, if we want to build stuff that's going to run with distro system Ruby packages, suddenly that means we can't take advantage of any improvements that have been made in that runtime in the last 4 years, which I think as an upstream, we're sort of like, yeah, that's done. But the consequence of that is, well, we need to start vendoring more of our own dependencies. So that's why if you install, and the packages are going to be named something different, and they're marked as obsoleting current packages, so you won't accidentally upgrade to Puppet 4 agents or anything like that. You would have to actually opt in by installing yum install puppet-agent or whatever it is, but that's going to kind of in a standard vendored sort of way. Stuff is going to go in opt, all your dependencies are taken care of for you. We have pre-built all the dependencies you're going to need, everything from the Ruby runtime itself to any other native libraries. It's all linked together and it all runs self-contained from that particular location. So that's something to be aware of. But a positive benefit of that is you can now have Puppet using updated dependencies for things, so it's a better experience there without perturbing your system Ruby, your system SSL libraries, your system, all of that stuff remains completely compartmentalized from your management software. So that's going to be happening. On the master side of things, probably the big thing that's going to be happening this year is sort of the transition from and I mentioned this at the beginning of the day, the transition from the current Ruby passenger Apache server setup to Puppet server, which I would encourage folks to actually try out and test out. So when Puppet 4 is released, we will still have support for running, rack, and basically rack passenger, WebRIC support. It's still going to be there. It's not going to go anywhere. But it's going to be marked as deprecated, and then in semantic versioning style, Puppet 5 will drop support for that stuff. So, obviously no one's putting a gun to anyone's head and saying that you have to upgrade or anything like that, but, part of the open source sort of stewardship is, all right, new major version, this stuff is deprecated, next major version, it's not gonna be there anymore. But you have the entire amount of time that, for that transition period to, kind of work out exactly how to move things over. For those of you who haven't used Puppet Server, by and large, almost all of your code, it should just work with all of your existing modules. If it doesn't, that's a bug, and it's something that we're pretty committed to fixing. If you're using a recent version of PE, you're already on Puppet Server. So if you didn't notice anything weird that happened during that transition, then great, mission accomplished. I think primarily the main difference would be, I think the only time you would be seriously, perhaps negatively affected would be if you're using a particularly exotic set of Ruby gems for some custom providers that rely on some pretty hairy native code. In 99.9% of those cases, there's like a JRuby equivalent for that gem that just by flipping around something in a gem file, all of that stuff tends to work. Everything from like, high-rate YAML to, all sorts of other things that do native system interop. Tends to not really be a big deal, but we still want to give people a decent chunk of time to actually do that migration. So, no one's getting a trapdoor pulled out from under them like once Puppet 4 is released, so people will have plenty of time. But it's a roadmap, so I'm telling you what's coming. So, beyond that, I would say in terms of Puppet 4, the probably biggest change is, well, how many people are currently running with the future parser flag turned on? So, okay. How many people have no idea what that is? Most people don't know what that is. Okay. So basically in Puppet, we've been sort of tightening up the semantics of the Puppet language, not like mega radical changes, but it's mostly weird corner cases, undefined behavior, just stupid bugs and stuff like that have kind of just, people have learned to deal with it, and modules are kind of coded expecting those bugs to exist. We've done a lot of cleanups for Puppet 4. So Puppet 4 tightens up semantics for things like undef. You can't automatically treat a string as a Boolean and stupid stuff like that, where it's like, is an empty string true or false? Like, it's neither, it's a string and not a Boolean. But there's existing, so basically, for the most part, most existing code, we've run analyses on all of the Forge modules that we have, and I think something like less than 5% of them aren't able to be parsed with the new parsers. So vast majority of code out in the wild shouldn't have any problems. But if you are using code that relies on some weird corner cases, or kind of anti-patterns, I guess, then that stuff is not going to work in 4. So what we've done is in most of the Puppet 3.x series, open source side, and it's also in PE, there is a flag you can give to your master and to your agents where you can say, I want to run with the next version of the Puppet language turned on, right? So you can opt in, and that way you can actually try out on your existing Puppet install, like what impact is that actually going to have? Will all my code continue to compile and things like that? We actually just finished merging some code. If you follow the dev list or you look at any of the GitHub traffic, we just merged some code maybe a week or two ago where that future parser setting is now something you could turn on a per environment basis. So you could actually just put nodes into a particular Puppet environment and say, just turn on the future parser for stuff in that environment. And you can maybe pick a representative set, a set of canaries, if you will, for all of your major archetypes of your systems. Put them in that environment, run them through the new parser, and see how it would work, and if everything's okay, great. But literally, the language in Puppet 4 is exactly the same as what we have with the future parser turned on in Puppet 3. So, we did that intentionally, let people on the current version of Puppet that they're using, give them some options to opt in, and then that is exactly what we're going to have. The next version, that's going to be the only option, and it's the default. So, you should already have some tools available to you to try out what's coming next. So you shouldn't be surprised. That's about as friendly as we can make it, I think. We are going to be working on, this will probably land, certainly in PE, probably in the next, maybe next release, but we're working on migration tooling that'll streamline moving from the current version of Puppet to the next version of Puppet. Probably the most notable set of changes that we're looking at putting in is basically, again, on a per environment basis, you can basically flag an environment and you can say, you know what, for any machine in this environment, when an agent requests a catalog, we'll compile it with the 3.x language and the 4.x language. And we'll diff the results of the resulting catalog and we'll send that back to the client. So you can get a report of what the differences would actually be. That's about as good as it's going to get, I think, in terms of migration tooling. Because now, there's a performance penalty for that because you're basically compiling everything twice. But the side effect is, by comparing, you actually get a before and after. So you can legitimately see what the actual impact would be. And hopefully all your catalogs end up looking the same, but in the case they don't, you should be able to actually see that happen. Probably the other big change that's going to happen in Puppet, well, this might actually be in the 3.x series, but for anyone, and I only mention this because I think it might be a big performance-related change, is for people that use directory environments, there's a timeout setting for basically how long we cache a bunch of information. I think the default is like 3 minutes, which, basically if you make changes to how your environments are configured, then you have to wait 3 minutes for the stuff to basically pick up those changes that happened. Or you could bounce your Puppet master, or if you're running Puppet server, there's just a REST endpoint that you can hit, and that just flushes the cache. You don't have to take anything down. However, from a lot of newbies, we've gotten reports from the field where they're sort of like, well, I made some changes and they don't take effect. Like, what happened? But then if I wait long enough, they do take effect. And it sort of is, I think a lot of users find that behavior somewhat, a lot of new folks, people new to Puppet, find that behavior somewhat astonishing. So what we just finished doing is we merged changes to basically flip that default to 0, which is that we cache nothing, which has the benefit of not being surprising because we reparse all this stuff every single request. But the trade-off is that it's slower because we're not caching anything. So I only bring this up, I mean, we're going to document it, it'll be in the release notes and everything like that, but this is one of those cases where the out-of-the-box experience is going to be tuned for safety and predictability, but for users that kind of know what they're doing and want more speed out of the system, and you understand, how to flush a cache and stuff like that whenever you make a change, you can obviously, jack that number up to whatever you want, and you get a lot of speed improvements from doing that. But it's just something I thought I would mention. Historically, we've, I would say a lot of that code in the 3x version tried to be very clever about when to, flush caches and stuff, and tried to do it automatically, and I don't know that it ever did a really great job. So we've cleaned a lot of that stuff up, but the side effect is now you need to be deliberate about when you want some of those caches flushed or not. But for those of you who have like a version control pipeline or something like that, this is post-commit hook or something like that you can just do, and it would just be automatic for you. Or just set it to 60 seconds or whatever you think makes sense for your environment. On the factor side of things, for those of you who follow the user list or the dev list, or if you're a Puppet Mount class, we've been working on a re-implementation of factor, porting it away from Ruby, and instead it runs in native code. It's just a compiled C++ program, which has a couple of benefits. Number one is it's portable to much more easy to port to the wide variety of systems that we want to run factor in the agent on. Like, again, it's not just servers anymore. People are increasingly running our stuff on network devices, as you saw earlier today. Storage devices, embedded gear, those kinds of things. So, we kind of need that. The lingua franca is basically, can GCC compile it? Then it can probably run anywhere. So that's kind of what we've done. And other side benefit is that it runs, I think, literally like almost, like 10 times as fast or something like that as current factor does, which is also pretty great. So in the factor 2x series, it's going to continue to be the Ruby-based one, starting with the new all-in-one agent that you're going to get for the Puppet 4 agent side. You'll have both available to you, and you can actually run Puppet agent --cfactor, and you'll get the native implementation. So you could try that out as well, but that's another one where Puppet 5 will swap to cfactor just being the default. And in fact, once cfactor hits, it's kind of 1.0 bar. Like, cfactor is going to be the next major version of factor. So that's maybe some inside baseball. I don't know that there's actually going to be some externally visible changes to anyone. All your custom facts will continue to work. You don't need to write a custom fact in C++ or anything like that. All your stuff in Ruby will continue to work. And in fact, with external fact support, you can write your custom facts in literally whatever language you want. It could be a script, as long as it's an executable, and you put it in a directory, and you give it a name, and it spits out something in a well-determined output format. We don't care, which is good. Broadly speaking, the trajectory for most of the stuff in terms of plugin APIs is really going to be around, like, I don't want people to have to know Ruby in order to customize Puppet. Because I want people to be able to customize Puppet using whatever languages they know, whether that's it's a Python shop, or all you know is Bash, or PowerShell, or whatever it is. Doesn't matter. You should still be able to participate and be consistent and customize stuff however you want. So Puppet 5, currently what we have slated to be in as part of Puppet 5 is probably not going to be anything that's super interesting to most folks, because a lot of it is under the hood. I think number one, what you'll see is, they're going to be, probably the biggest change would be if you're hitting some of the Puppet Master endpoints for integration, like you're using it programmatically, like its API, we'll be changing the prefixes of some of those URLs to have version numbers in them, so we can maintain backwards compatibility going forward. That will probably affect literally nobody in this room, I'm gonna guess. But it's a change to the externally facing API, which means we gotta tick up to make the version number. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about in terms of like Puppet 5. So I wouldn't be scared that it's just a number. It'll be okay. But that's something where your modules, for example, would be totally unaffected. But there may be some other breaking changes that slip in there, but we would let people know as that's coming. And again, like we did in the 3x series with the feature parser, we'll probably have all those breaking changes protected by feature flags. So even if you're on the 4x series, you can try them out and see what's going to happen. So flipping over to the Puppet Enterprise side of things, again, I think probably the thing you're going to see land first is vastly improved migration tooling. So if you're on an existing version of PE, the next version is going to have way better facilities to migrate, say, your old classification groups from the previous classifier into the new rules-based one. There'll be much better tools, again, in order to do some of that like catalog diffing and reporting and analysis, so you can see more easily which of your modules aren't compatible with the new version of Puppet. Those are things that we're going to be rolling out fairly soon. Beyond that, we're also working on things that I would put under the umbrella, and this is sort of over the course of the year, kind of the PE platform side of things. We're working on stuff to basically make all the major components and services inside of PE. We're putting a lot of work into sort of resilience and more turnkey scale out. For example, we're actively working on services that the PE version of Puppet Server will have embedded into it mechanisms for doing file synchronization between masters in a way that's atomic. Like obviously right now, if you stand up 15 masters, you can run rsync in a cron job or something like that. But what we're going to be doing in PE is basically having API endpoints and command line tooling that, again, you can plug into post-commit hooks and things like that. So you can basically say, here's a change to my Puppet code, propagate this to all the masters in my environment in a way that's sort of transactional and atomic. So basically we can stage all those changes into different places on each master, basically ping them on API endpoints to say, drain all the current requests so you're not picking up partial copies of things, like you have half of a new module file or something like that, that would be bad. And then kind of atomically swap stuff into place and then open the floodgates again so stuff can get put back in place. And that's to make just turnkey scale out on the PE side a lot easier. So that's going to be coming, and that's part of the code management sort of work stream that we've got going on. Better ways of staging your Puppet code and actually getting that out to all the masters that you care about. I would also say that coming up is going to be some pretty big performance improvements in the actual PE console, especially around Event Inspector and other things like that. Most of that is because we're porting over from using the old sort of dashboard database code to pulling data directly out of PuppetDB, which has much faster endpoints to get a lot of that data. So again, that's not going to be huge end user visibility other than stuff should be faster, especially with a higher number of nodes or a larger number of reports or a larger number of events that you're dealing with. And then again, on the in terms of resiliency, we're working on the PuppetDB front. You'll see in an upcoming version of PE high availability for that, where it's application level replication between multiple PuppetDB daemons. So if you're currently running Postgres streaming replication or something like that, you can continue to do that. But if you don't care or you don't want to do that, it's fine. You can just stand up another PuppetDB instance, and the applications themselves will know how to talk to each other and replicate data to each other. And there'll be failover and things like that built into all the communications protocol. So that's kind of taken care of for you if you want to do that, which is why it's an enterprise feature. Razor will also hit general availability, so those of you using that on a Puppet Enterprise stack, it will actually be a supported thing. We'll maintain it for a long time. You can file support tickets against it and stuff like that. And Scott will fix them all, I'm sure, within 24 hours. And lastly, probably the big thing I'll kind of close off with is a major focus for us, kind of at a platform level, is over the course of the year, we'll probably be moving things. Right now, Puppet is very good at managing sort of relationships between resources on a single system. And I think one of the major initiatives that we're actively working on is taking that sort of graph of how resources are built and how they relate to each other on a single system and make it so that you can express relationships between components on systems. So that way, if you have an application, you could say, look, here's my app. I've got, it needs a database, it needs some application servers, it needs some front-end load balancers, and Puppet knows how all those are related to each other in a way that actually spans systems. So for those of you who understand Puppet internals, this is a way of thinking about, we currently have an acyclic graph that represents the config of a single system. We basically will end up with another one that is a graph of how these components are connected to each other. And you'll start to see tools sort of trickle out over the course of the year that'll be able to take that graph and do things like, I need to push out an update to my application. Okay, how do I do that? Well, because we know how they all relate to each other and what depends on what, we know what order to actually push out updates in for all the systems. So you don't have to have like a text file with all of your systems in order, because we can just figure that out for you. And the good news is as you add and remove systems, that graph those relationships are still codified in that graph, so we can do stuff. So basically all the benefits of modeling what your desired state looks like for one system, take that up a notch, and you get all those same benefits from modeling stuff that works across systems. So that's pretty early on, and it's going to be full spectrum, so there'll be changes that are going to have to land in the language itself, like affordances in the syntax, the Puppet DSL, so you can describe an application. So you can do information sharing between different components without having to hard code host names and things like that. As well as tooling that can interpret and store that graph for your infrastructure, that infrastructure graph. Like, what does it look like? Where do we put it? As well as tools that integrate that with how to actually do deployments, drive things through mCollective or other third-party orchestrators that can do stuff like that. So that stuff is all pretty interesting, and that's good. You'll see a lot more activity, I think, around that and questions around that on the development list and IRC channel as the year progresses. It's still pretty early on, but eventually we'll get there. Yeah, so I think that's basically it. That's kind of the roadmap. I'll be around for the happy hour if people have any other questions. But
what's the timeline on it?
For open source Puppet 4, I think it's never been closer. No, it's legitimately very, very close. Like probably within it's a matter of weeks, I would say. If you're on, I think EL7 is probably the first one that'll roll out. The all-in-one agents for that, and master packages and stuff like that, just because that's by far the most popular platform that we've got. But eventually, other stuff will trickle out over the next, within days of that. So I think that and Windows are going to be first, just because that tends to iron out most of the bugs, because that's two ends of the continuum, right? And then you'll see the other Unixes kind of float out there after that. Any other questions? All right, thanks.